Chapter 1. A Stranger in the Dark. The universe, as vast and infinite as it was filled with so much that could not be understood. It was an endless void, punctuated by scattered stars, nebulae, and planets that orbited unseen suns. For most, the stars were mere pinpricks in the night sky, distant and unapproachable. But for Captain Elias Novak, the stars were his home. They were the canvas on which he had painted his life, a life spent among the cosmos, charting unknown galaxies, navigating hostile environments, and engaging with alien species that most would never encounter in a lifetime. Elias sat in the cockpit of the Vanguard, his trusted ship, a sleek, silver vessel that had seen countless battles and survived innumerable skirmishes across the galaxy. The ship was more than just a machine to him. It was an extension of his very soul. It had been his companion for years, carrying him through the darkest reaches of space and back again. But it wasn't the ship that made Elias who he was. It was his reputation as a soldier, a tactician, and a survivor. He had crossed through war zones and diplomatic messes, dealt with smugglers, and even pirates on occasion. He was a man who could take on any challenge, face any enemy, and yet, as he sat alone in the cockpit of the Vanguard on this particular mission, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was about to happen, something that he wasn't ready for. It all began with a simple distress signal, a tiny blip on his radar, weak and intermittent. At first, it was easy to ignore, chalking it up to a stray satellite or a malfunction in his system. But something in the pit of his stomach told him to follow it. Maybe it was the quiet after a few days in deep space, the monotony of travel that made him yearn for something new, some challenge to break the endless silence. Maybe it was just curiosity. Whatever it was, Elias couldn't resist. He brought the Vanguard out of its course and towards the unknown signal, tracing its weak origin. The planet it came from was uncharted, one of those lifeless worlds at the edge of the galaxy that no one thought twice about. No notable resources. No signs of civilization. Just another dot in the galaxy map. Yet here it was, sending out a desperate call, as if begging to be found. Maybe just a derelict ship or a forgotten outpost. Elias muttered to himself as he navigated the ship closer to the planet's atmosphere. Nothing too complicated. He was wrong. The moment the ship pierced through the planet's dense atmosphere, Elias immediately felt something strange. It wasn't anything he could put his finger on, but the planet seemed off. There was an eerie stillness in the air, no wildlife, no natural sounds, just the hum of his ship and the distant crash of a lightning storm somewhere on the horizon. The planet's surface was a mix of rocky cliffs and dusty plains, barren and lifeless. His sensors detected nothing of interest, no active technology, no sources of energy. Yet that distress signal persisted, pulling him further into the desolation. As the Vanguard descended onto the surface, Elias activated the landing gear, the ship gently touching down on a flat plateau of rock. He remained seated for a moment, staring at the readouts. There was nothing here that should have made sense. Why was there a signal coming from this planet in the first place? Why had no one bothered to investigate this place for so long? And who, or what, had been calling out? His questions went unanswered as he prepared to leave the ship. Grabbing his gear blasters, comms, scanning devices, Elias took a deep breath. His boots hit the surface with a soft thud, the ground cracked beneath his weight, and he could feel the moisture in the air, thick and unsettling, as though the planet was alive in a way that wasn't immediately apparent. He activated his helmet, the visor instantly tinting to provide him with enhanced vision. The sound of distant thunder rumbled in the distance as Elias began walking towards the source of the distress signal. The terrain was harsh, jagged rock formations leading to a hollowed-out valley. It was here, amidst the barren emptiness, that he felt a strange pull, something instinctive, like the hairs on the back of his neck rising. He wasn't sure how long he had walked, but it felt like hours. The deeper he moved, the more the air grew heavy, the closer the storm seemed to come. The signal was closer now, much closer, but there was no sign of any shipwrecks or outposts. Just rocks, and more rocks, and the constant sound of wind picking up, howling across the barren landscape. Elias moved faster, driven by the need to answer the mystery that had lured him here, but he couldn't shake the sense that someone was watching him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Then, through the mist and gloom, he saw it. A structure, half buried in the earth, covered by dirt and twisted metal. The remnants of what had once been a research station or military outpost. The debris had clearly been here for a long time. Rusted metal, broken windows, half-collapsed walls. But that wasn't what caught Elias' attention. It was the figure in the doorway. A tall, imposing woman, clad in tattered but functional combat gear. Her body was muscular, her stance strong and defiant, as though she had been standing there for years, waiting for someone to find her. She didn't flinch when Elias approached, didn't move at all. She stood there, her long dark hair matted to her face, eyes wide and unblinking. Her eyes locked onto Elias the moment he stepped into her field of vision, and in that instant, time seemed to slow. She was no ordinary woman. She was something else entirely, something otherworldly. Her eyes weren't just human. They were glowing faintly, a deep violet hue that shone even in the dim light. She was unlike anything he had ever seen. Even in his years of navigating the galaxy and meeting species from countless star systems. Her voice was rough, hoarse, as though she had not spoken in days or perhaps weeks. "Help me," she said, her words barely audible over the wind. "Please, they're coming for me." Elias took a hesitant step forward, keeping his distance. He had seen warriors before, alien species, human soldiers, mercenaries, but this woman, there was something about her. Something fierce, but broken. Her voice held the weight of experience, of battles fought and lost, of hardships beyond what most could ever comprehend. "Who's coming for you?" Elias asked, his tone steady but with a hint of caution. His mind raced, processing the situation. This woman, this alien warrior, was in distress, and the pulse of the signal that had led him here was only getting stronger. "Not what?" She corrected him, her gaze darkening. "Who?" "The Zarians. They are coming to finish what they started." The name sent a jolt through Elias' spine. The Zarians were notorious for their brutal conquests across the galaxy, enslaving entire civilizations and eradicating any who resisted their reign. It didn't take much for Elias to understand the gravity of the situation. "I'm not who you think I am," she continued, her voice shaking slightly, betraying her previous composure. "I was once one of them, but I broke free. Now, they'll stop at nothing to hunt me down." Elias felt the weight of her words, and a strange wave of empathy washed over him. She wasn't just any soldier. She wasn't just another warrior. She was someone who had betrayed her own people for a cause, probably a cause far more complicated than she had revealed. "Then we need to get you out of here," Elias said. He moved toward her, his hand reaching out slowly, trying to close the distance between them. "We'll get you off this planet and back to the Vanguard. We're not staying long. The Zarians won't find you if we leave now." But the woman did not take his hand. Instead, she stepped back, shaking her head. Her expression hardened. "No, they'll find us. They'll find us wherever we go. You don't understand." I dash. She was cut off by a sudden loud noise, the unmistakable sound of ships descending from the sky. The unmistakable sound of Zarian hunters closing in on their prey. Elias turned quickly, his instincts kicking in. The woman's face grew even paler as she reached for the weapon on her belt, but Elias had already acted. He pulled her behind a stack of broken metal crates just as several Zarian ships appeared in the sky, their engines screeching through the air. "You're not alone," Elias whispered to her, his hand gripping her shoulder. "I'll make sure they don't take you. Not today." The battle had only just begun. Elias's heart raced as he pulled the alien woman behind the debris, instinctively positioning himself between her and the descending ships. His breath quickened as the shadows of the Zarian vessels filled the sky, darkening the space above the planet's barren surface. The low hum of their engines reverberated through the air, sending a chill down his spine. The Zarians were here. The woman, this warrior, was still breathing heavily, her eyes wide with fear and something else, something Elias couldn't quite place. She wasn't the panic type. She was a soldier, a warrior, but even she seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. "They'll find us," she said in a low, hoarse voice, her breath catching in her throat. "There's no way out of this." "No, there is," Elias replied sharply, his mind racing. "We just need to stay one step ahead." The Zarian ships circled overhead like vultures, waiting for a sign of weakness. Their designs were sleek and intimidating, built for both speed and combat. The The Zarians themselves were ruthless, a race known for their advanced military tactics and their willingness to do anything to capture their prey. Elias had heard of them before. Their reign of terror across the galaxy had earned them a reputation that was feared and loathed in equal measure. To cross paths with them was to risk everything. And now, he was caught in the crossfire, with only an alien woman he barely knew for company. "Listen," Elias said, his voice firm, his eyes scanning the terrain for any potential escape routes. "We don't have much time. We'll take cover under the ridge up ahead. It's rocky, and the ships won't be able to track us in the shadows. Stay close." The woman hesitated, her gaze lingering on the ships above. She had no reason to trust him, no reason to believe he could protect her. But the desperation in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. She was willing to take a chance. Slowly, she nodded. Elias moved swiftly, grabbing her hand to pull her along with him. They darted across the rocky landscape, using the natural outcrops and ridges for cover. The sound of the Zarian ships grew louder, their engines slicing through the air as they searched the terrain below. Elias's mind was working at full speed, calculating the best path to avoid being detected. He couldn't risk being caught by those ships. If they were anything like the stories, their interrogation techniques were brutal, lethal even. They reached the ridge, crouching low behind the jagged rock face, and Elias took a moment to assess their situation. The Zarians hadn't spotted them yet, but they wouldn't be so lucky for long. They needed to move quickly, find a way to disable the ships or escape before they became a target. "We'll make it through this," Elias said, his tone reassuring but with an undercurrent of tension. He glanced at her again, and for the first time, he truly took in her appearance. She was tall, with a striking presence. Her face, though marked by exhaustion, was undeniably beautiful in its strength-sharp cheekbones, piercing eyes that glowed with an otherworldly light. Her hair was dark, cascading down her back in wild waves, and her body was sculpted, honed through years of battle. She was a warrior through and through, but here she was, relying on him, a stranger. "What's your name?" Elias asked, realizing he hadn't even thought to ask earlier. She turned to him, her gaze sharp and calculating. "You can call me Kara," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that lingered beneath it. "And if we're going to survive this, I suggest you focus on getting us out of here, not on who I am." Elias couldn't help but smirk slightly at her bluntness. "Fair enough," he said, turning his attention back to the ships overhead. "Kara, I'm going to get us out of here. But we need to work together. I can't do this alone." Kara's lips tightened into a firm line. "I don't need saving," she said, her tone hardening. "But I'll help you. We don't have much choice." Elias nodded, feeling the weight of the situation press down on him. They were both in this together, whether they liked it or not. He had no idea how they were going to escape the Zarians, but for now, their survival depended on them working as a team. They couldn't afford to be divided. The ships were getting closer, their search patterns becoming more intense. "Stay low," Elias ordered, motioning for her to follow as he moved deeper into the rocky terrain. "The storm will help cover us. We just need to stay off their radar until we can make our next move." Kara followed without hesitation, and together, they moved further into the jagged rocks, where the natural landscape offered a bit of protection. The storm, which had been a faint rumble earlier, now intensified, rain beginning to pour in sheets. Elias glanced at Kara once more, noticing the subtle tension in her posture, the way her eyes darted toward every noise. She was a warrior, he realized, but there was something else in her, a fear of what was coming. "We'll be all right," Elias said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed his own words. "I'm not afraid of them," Kara replied, her voice firm, though Elias could see the edge of uncertainty in her eyes. "But I don't think they'll let us go easily." Elias didn't respond. He knew exactly what she meant. The Zarians wouldn't stop until they had her. And by extension, they wouldn't stop until they had him, too. This mission had gone from a simple rescue operation to a fight for survival. The first ship passed overhead, its engines roaring as it scanned the ground below. Elias held his breath, his body pressed flat against the wet rock. He didn't dare move an inch. The ship's shadows loomed large, casting a dark veil over the rocky plateau, and for a long moment, it seemed like the ship was going to land right where they were hiding. The wind howled louder as the ship hovered above, But then, mercifully, it moved on, leaving them undetected. Elias let out a quiet breath, and Kara gave him a sideways glance. There was no time to relax. They still had to move. The moment they were spotted, they'd be trapped. "Let's go," Elias whispered, his voice low and urgent. "We've got one shot." Chapter 2. The Unexpected Alliance. The terrain shifted beneath their feet as they continued their trek through the rocky hills, the storm still raging in full force above them. The rain drenched them to the bone, but it offered some protection at least for now from the Zarian ships that continued to patrol the skies. Elias and Kara moved cautiously, each step deliberate, aware that the slightest misstep could give them away. Elias was no stranger to combat, but this was different. The stakes were higher now, the odds stacked against them. The Zarians weren't just any adversary, they were ruthless, calculating, and relentless. But Elias wasn't about to give up. Not when there was a chance to survive, not when Kara was relying on him. Kara had proven herself to be more than capable. In the brief moments they had spent together, Elias had seen her strength, her resolve, and the sharpness of her mind. She didn't need him to protect her, she needed him as an ally. She knew how to fight, how to survive. But she also knew something that Elias didn't, something about the Zarians, something about her past that she wasn't sharing. As they crept through the valley, Elias could feel the tension between them. They had no time for small talk, no time for pleasantries. They were both focused on one thing: getting out alive. But the silence was deafening, and Elias couldn't help but wonder about the woman beside him. "What's your story, Kara?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence. He needed to know more. The sense of mystery about her was eating at him. "How did you end up here?" Kara didn't answer immediately, and Elias could feel the weight of her hesitation. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and almost pained. "I was once one of them," she said quietly, her gaze focused on the path ahead. "I was part of the Zarian forces. But I couldn't take it anymore, the violence, the bloodshed. I escaped. I ran. And now they want me back." Elias stopped in his tracks, his heart racing. "You were one of them? A soldier for the Zarians?" Kara nodded, her jaw set tight. "I didn't have a choice. It wasn't something I wanted, but it was something I was born into. They're a merciless people, Elias. And once they have you, they never let go." The truth of her words hit Elias hard. She wasn't just another survivor. She was a deserter, someone who had risked everything to escape the horrors of the Zarian Empire. And now, those same horrors were chasing her down, determined to drag her back into their fold. Elias's mind raced. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about redemption, about freeing someone from a past they could never outrun. He had no idea how they would escape the Zarians, but one thing was clear: they weren't in this alone anymore. They were a team, bound together by a shared will to survive. "I'll help you," Elias said, his voice steady, firm. "We'll make sure they don't catch you." Kara turned to face him, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if testing his sincerity. She said nothing, but the tension in her body seemed to ease just a fraction. "Thank you," she said softly. "You might be the only person who can help me." With that, they both continued forward, knowing that the path ahead was fraught with danger. But for the first time since they had met, Elias felt like they had a chance. Together, they could fight back. Together, they could survive. And maybe, just maybe together, they could take on the Zarians. The silence between Elias and Kara lingered as they continued their trek through the rocky terrain. The storm had shifted from a steady downpour to an overwhelming torrent, the wind howling through the jagged landscape, sending cold droplets pelting their faces. The world around them seemed like an oppressive blur, the sound of their footsteps lost in the rush of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. Elias couldn't shake the feeling of urgency that pressed against his chest. Every step was calculated, every movement done in quiet synchronization with Kara. The Zarian ships were still out there, their low hum filling the air as they prowled for their prey. It felt like they were always just one step behind, but Elias didn't dare look back. He knew he couldn't afford to. Every second mattered now. Kara led the way through the jagged rocks, her movements as sure and calculated as her earlier words. Her past as a Zarian soldier was something Elias would have to digest later. For now, he was more focused on keeping them alive. They had to stay hidden. They couldn't let their movements be tracked. The Zarians were hunting them, and if they didn't find cover soon, it would be too late. They reached a narrow ravine, a thin passage between two towering cliffs. It wasn't much, but it would offer shelter from the Zarian ships overhead. Kara glanced around, assessing the situation, and nodded. "This way," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She led Elias into the ravine, and the two of them squeezed through the tight opening. The walls of the ravine rose steeply on either side, blocking their view of the ships that circled above. The air in the ravine was damp and heavy, the moisture from the storm collecting on the rock walls. Elias leaned against the cool stone, trying to catch his breath, but his mind was far from the safety of the ravine. He had to think of a plan, something that would give them a fighting chance against the Zarians. Kara, sensing his unease, looked at him and said, "We need to disable their ships. If we don't, they'll track us. They won't stop until they find us." Elias's mind raced. "How do you propose we do that? We're not exactly armed for a fight against their fleet." Kara's eyes flickered with a cold intensity. "You've got a ship, the Vanguard. If we can reach it, I can show you how to disable their ships. I know their systems. I was trained to take them down." Elias blinked, surprised by the confidence in her voice. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," Kara replied, her expression hardening. "I may not be with them anymore, but I still know their tactics. I know their weaknesses. If we can get close enough to their ships, I can access their systems and fry their engines. Disable their weapons. They won't be able to track us once we're done." Elias considered her words. He wasn't a tech expert, but he trusted her. She'd already proven herself capable in the short time they'd been together. The Zarians were ruthless, but they weren't invincible. If Kara could really do what she said, this could be their chance to escape. "All right," Elias said, his tone determined. "But we need to move fast. We can't afford to waste time." They both looked at each other, the weight of their mission settling between them. There was no turning back now. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about taking a stand. The Zarians had crossed the line when they came after Kara, and now, Elias had a new mission, to make sure they didn't get away with it. Kara nodded. "Follow my lead. We'll move quickly. I know where the Zarian ships are stationed. If we can make it through the forest, we can get to your ship." The rain continued to pour down in torrents, but they had no choice but to press forward. Together, they moved through the ravine, each step pushing them closer to their goal. Elias felt the bond between them grow stronger with every passing minute. They weren't just allies anymore. They were partners, fighting for the same thing, freedom. As they moved deeper into the ravine, the sound of the Zarian ships above faded into the distance. And for the first time since the storm had started, Elias allowed himself to relax, if only for a moment. He was no longer alone in this fight. He had Kara by his side, and with her knowledge and his determination, they had a chance. Chapter 3: The Zarian Threat. The night pressed on as Elias and Kara navigated the treacherous landscape. The storm had reached its peak, the thunder clashing overhead with the fury of 1,000 storms, the rain falling in sheets that seemed to blur everything around them. The dense forest they had entered was difficult to navigate, with roots and rocks obstructing their path, but Kara moved like she was born for this environment. Elias had trouble keeping up with her pace, his legs still sore from earlier, but he pushed through, determined to stay on her heels. The cold wetness clung to him as they moved through the underbrush, the darkness of the forest amplifying the feeling of being hunted. He couldn't shake the feeling that the Zarians were closer now, that they were tightening their net around them. He was right to feel that way. The sound of distant engines thrummed in the air, unmistakable and unsettling. The Zarian fleet had increased their patrols. Their ships were scanning the terrain with precision, their advanced sensors sweeping the forest floor in search of anything that moved. "We're close," Kara whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "Stay down. The ships are just ahead." They moved into the trees, crouching low, careful not to make a sound. Elias's breath was steady, his every sense heightened. His heart pounded in his chest, and the weight of what they were about to do pressed down on him. The Zarians were merciless, but if Kara could disable their ships, they might have a chance to escape. They reached a clearing in the forest where the Zarian ships had landed. The dark shapes of the vessels loomed against the dim sky, their engines idle for the moment, but Elias knew it wouldn't last. The patrols would return soon, and they would be looking for anything that wasn't supposed to be there. Kara's eyes narrowed as she scanned the ships, calculating their positions, their vulnerabilities. I can get us close, she said quietly. But we'll need to be fast. If we're seen, this is over. Elias nodded, his focus unbroken. This was at the moment they'd been preparing for. They crept forward, using the cover of the trees and the noise of the storm to mask their movements. The Zarian ships sat silently, vulnerable for now. But Elias knew that time was slipping away. They had to move quickly. As they reached the outskirts of the camp, Elias looked to Kara for direction. She pointed silently to a ship at the far side of the clearing, its hull marked with the unmistakable insignia of the Zarians. That was their target. If Kara could access the ship's systems, they could disable the entire fleet. But getting to the ship undetected would be the hardest part. Elias stepped forward, his heart in his throat, and as he moved, the world around him seemed to slow. His focus narrowed to the sound of his breath, to the rustling of the leaves beneath his boots. Every step was a calculated risk, but he didn't have the luxury of hesitation. Suddenly, the sound of engines pierced the air. A Zarian patrol ship was approaching, its lights cutting through the darkness. Elias froze, his body tensing, and Kara's eyes flashed with urgency. Now, she whispered. We move, or we're done. Without another word, they broke cover, running low and fast, their bodies blending into the shadows of the trees. The Zarian ship roared overhead, its engines almost deafening, but they had already reached the vessel they were after. Kara was already at the access panel, her hands moving with precision as she hacked into the system. Elias kept watch, his heart hammering in his chest. The ship's engines hummed, the access panel flickering with lights as Kara worked her magic. Almost there, she muttered under her breath. The sound of approaching footsteps sent a jolt through Elias. The patrol was closing in. They had mere seconds. Done, Kara said with a triumphant grin, stepping back as the ship's systems began to power down. They're blind now. They won't be able to track us. Elias exhaled in relief as the lights on the Zarian ships flickered and died. The ship was theirs, and with it, the power to escape. Let's go, Elias said, his voice steady. We've got our chance. They sprinted back into the shadows, the sound of Zarian ships now fading into the distance. They had bought themselves some time, but the Zarians would be back, and the hunt was far from over. Elias's heart raced as the seconds ticked by. The Zarian patrol was close, but Kara's handiwork had given them a fighting chance. The Zarian ships now stood silent, their once blinding lights now dim, their engines sputtering into a quiet hum. Elias could feel the weight of their success bearing down on him. Kara had done it, they had crippled the enemy fleet for the moment. But the storm still raged, and Elias knew that silence wouldn't last long. The Zarians were relentless, and if they couldn't find another way off this planet soon, they'd be hunted down, just like the prey they had been moments ago. We need to move, Kara said, her voice low but full of urgency. She didn't waste any time, her focus was razor-sharp, as if the fight had only just begun. If we stay here too long, they'll figure it out. Elias nodded, his thoughts already racing ahead to their next steps. He couldn't afford to hesitate. Not now. They were a step ahead of the Zarians, but that wouldn't last. The storm and the disarray in their ranks would only buy them time, not a free pass. The forest around them was thick with rain, mud, and mist. They moved through the trees like shadows, careful to avoid making noise as they trekked deeper into the wilderness. The Zarian ships above were grounded for now, but that didn't mean they were out of danger. Kara moved swiftly ahead, her gaze always darting between the darkness, scanning for any sign of movement or another patrol. Elias kept his eyes on the horizon, his senses alert, ready to react at a moment's notice. They needed to reach the vanguard, the only way they'd be able to escape this planet and avoid the Zarians' wrath. As they approached a narrow pass between the rocks, Kara held up her hand, signaling for him to stop. Elias obeyed without a word, watching as she crouched low, her eyes scanning the clearing ahead. Through the torrential rain, he could see the shadow of another Zarian ship, its landing gears deployed and engines still. A patrol was set up, waiting for the storm to clear. The ships were circling again, looking for any sign of movement. We can't go through there, Kara whispered. Her hand reached for her side, where a small device was strapped to her waist. She pulled it out, a sleek black box, and pressed a button. A faint blue glow emerged from the device as it emitted a signal to the Vanguard, a coded beacon that only the ship would respond to. Elias's breath caught in his throat. "What's that?" "Just a little insurance," Kara replied, her eyes hard with determination. "We can't risk walking straight into their line of sight. The Vanguard will detect the signal and come to us. We just need to hold out until it arrives." Elias nodded, his mind working quickly. They didn't have much time, but the plan was the best they had. With the Zarian ships stationed ahead, they couldn't risk being spotted. The Vanguard was their only hope now. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as they waited in the cold, soaked to the bone by the rain. The storm seemed to become even more violent, as if nature itself were waging war on them. The wind howled, and the rain turned into sheets of icy water that cut through their clothes. They huddled under the cover of the trees, their breath visible in the freezing air. Finally, the familiar hum of the Vanguard echoed through the storm. A faint flicker of light appeared in the distance, growing stronger with each passing second. The ship had found them. It wasn't much longer now. The first Zarian ship to pass overhead seemed oblivious to the signal they had sent, its sensors picking up only static. Elias exhaled, a surge of relief washing over him. The Zarians were momentarily distracted, and now they had a chance to make a run for it. "Let's move," Elias said. He was ready to fight for this escape if necessary, but for now, he preferred the element of surprise. Kara nodded, her face a mask of focus. She led the way, her steps quick and efficient as they darted through the rain-drenched forest, moving toward the clearing where the Vanguard would land. The moment they reached the clearing, the ship descended from the sky, its silhouette cutting through the mist. Elias watched as the ramp of the ship lowered, the bright lights from within casting shadows across the terrain. He and Kara wasted no time. They dashed toward the open ramp, the Zarian patrol now distant and distracted, unaware of their approach. "Move, move, move," Elias urged, his voice urgent. They sprinted up the ramp, and the moment they were aboard, the doors sealed behind them with a metallic hiss. The Vanguard's engines roared to life, and the ship lifted off, rising above the forest and disappearing into the cloud-choked sky. Elias took a deep breath as he looked out of the viewport. Below, the vast wilderness spread out like an ocean of shadows and trees, the Zarian ships nowhere in sight. They had escaped for now. Kara stepped beside him, her expression unreadable as she watched the planet fade from view. "That was too close," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of everything she had just gone through. "Thank you for helping me." Elias turned to her, his gaze softening. "We're in this together now. You don't owe me anything." She met his gaze, and for a moment, something passed between them, a silent understanding that neither of them had expected. The battle for survival had just begun, but for the first time in a long while, Elias felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone. "I guess we both have a lot to thank each other for," Kara said, her lips curving into a small, almost imperceptible smile. Elias smirked in return, feeling the tension of the past hours begin to ease. "We make a good team." As the Vanguard surged through the galaxy, leaving the dangerous planet behind, Elias couldn't help but wonder what would come next. There were still many questions to be answered, especially regarding Kara's past. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough. They had survived the night. Chapter 4, A New Beginning. The next few days were a blur of routine as the Vanguard sailed deeper into the galaxy, far from the dangers of the Zarian fleet. Elias spent his time making repairs on the ship, ensuring that everything was in top condition, while Kara stayed to herself, contemplating the events that had led her here. Though Elias respected her need for space, he knew they couldn't avoid talking about the past forever. Kara wasn't just any warrior, she was a deserter, someone who had once fought alongside the very people who had now come to hunt her down. Elias had his own past, he wasn't without his demons, but Kara's story seemed different. It was something that couldn't be ignored, and Elias knew that eventually, she'd open up when she was ready. One evening, as the stars streaked across the ship's viewing windows, Kara came to him. She looked different, less guarded, more at ease in her surroundings. She had let down the walls she'd been hiding behind, even if just for a moment. "I need to tell you something," Kara said, her voice quieter now than it had been before. "I'm not just a deserter. I had a family, a life I left behind when I fled the Zarians. My people, they need me. There's something more to this than just running away from them. I thought I could escape everything, but now, I'm realizing that I can't run forever. Elias stood, moving toward her, his expression serious but understanding. You don't have to face it alone, Kara. Whatever's out there, we'll deal with it together. She met his gaze, and for the first time, Elias saw the vulnerability beneath her hardened exterior. It was fleeting, but it was enough to make him understand. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore, she was fighting for something greater. You're right, she said, her voice stronger now. We'll fight. Together. Elias nodded. Together. The Vanguard continued its journey through the stars, the two of them now bound not just by survival, but by a shared understanding of what it meant to face the darkness together.